Hi everyone, this is a quick video about the readings in week 5 of BEH385. This week we're reading chapters 12 and 14 in Basics of Social Research. I won't be talking about the reading in Statistics in Plain English because we had that chapter in the last class, so I'll just be talking about the two chapters from the Basics of Social Research. So the first chapter is about evaluation research. This is the kind of work that I do predominantly, so this chapter is kind of important to me on a personal level in that, but it's also an area of research where it's pretty prevalent. It's very common. There's a lot of work in the area of evaluation research. Projects, programs, schools always need evaluation done. And so if you are trained in doing evaluation work, it's a pretty marketable skill. And so in this chapter, we talk about the kinds of evaluation research, how you go about approaching the evaluation work, thinking about the problem that you're trying to address or the question you're trying to answer. Typically in evaluation work, obviously we are looking at the effect of program A on outcome B. We want to know how effective a program is, how effective a teacher is, is this program worthwhile? And so we have an evaluation. So some of the things that are important in there is deciding what is the purpose of this program or this intervention, how do we know that the program or the intervention has been successful, and then how do we measure that? So what are the outcomes and how do we measure those outcomes is kind of what happens at the beginning of this chapter. There's important discussion about talking about making sure that you as the evaluator know exactly what the intervention is, how it works, who it's supposed to be working on, who's the population of interest, and then talking about what is the best way to go about measuring the effectiveness of that program. There's choices to be made about developing your own measures, like we talked about last week with survey design, or using an existing measure. So there's some talk about that there. Then there is more discussion about the types of evaluation research design. So we have experimental designs, which is basically randomized controlled trials, when individuals are randomly assigned to receiving an intervention or receiving a treatment or not. That's pretty rare in social science research for multiple reasons, but is an option. Then we have quasi-experimental design, where we are able to manipulate the research situation or context in such a way we can assume that the groups are as equal as if they were randomly assigned for the outcome of interest. And then we have qualitative evaluations, and that just kind of builds on the prior reading we've done in other chapters about qualitative research in general. And then some discussion about the use of those results. And I think there's good handling in this chapter about the idea that when you're the evaluator, sometimes there are some difficult parts of your job there. People's jobs might be at stake depending on what your research shows, programs that people really care about. If your research doesn't support the outcomes that they want to see, there's definitely some political nuances to doing evaluation research. And I think this chapter does a good job of bringing up that reality in the discussion of the types of evaluation research and what you do with the research results and how they're used. And then the chapter ends with a couple of really good examples of social indicators research, just using social indicators as measures. And those are some nice descriptions. And then like with pretty much every chapter we've had, there's a discussion of ethics and evaluation at the end of the chapter that I think is good. Again, when you're dealing with, when your evaluation research matters for people who are receiving an intervention, matters for people who have a job or not based on your research, it's important to really think about the ethics involved in that work that you do. And so the chapter ends with a discussion on that point. Then in chapter 14 is a bit more of a nuts and bolts kind of hands-on sort of chapter. It's really just kind of giving you a broad overview of quantitative data analysis. Again, this is a lot of my bread and butter, a lot of the work that I do. This kind of gives you a basic introduction to what that looks like, how we get data, how do we get raw data to begin with, and what do we do with it from the very beginning? How do we clean that data? How do we make sure we know what's happening in all of our data so that we can then manipulate it with statistical modeling? So the chapter starts off with how we quantify data. So something as simple as someone fills out a survey and marks a box for male or female. How do you quantify that? How do you turn that into numbers? What's the best way to do that? And then it goes on to talk about codebook construction. Basically that you have some sort of a manual where anybody can come up to the data and have this codebook and know what every variable in your data means, what every value for every variable means, because you have a codebook. And then discussion about data entry and different ways that data entry happens. Sometimes it happens automatically when someone fills out their survey on a computer. Sometimes researchers or undergraduates or graduate research assistants, somebody has to enter it by hand. Just kind of the discussions about how data gets entered there. Then there's discussion about univariate analysis, and this is should be a little bit of review, talking about distribution, central tendency, and dispersion. That's all stuff that we covered in BEH385. So, mean, median, and mode, standard deviation, variance, those sorts of things. Those are things that you should already be familiar with. And then additionally, continuous and discrete variables. Again, that should be something that is review based on being in the second half of this class. Next, there's discussion of subgroup comparisons, and this is kind of just leading into this idea of multiple regression, because that's what we do in multiple regression is we're comparing a bunch of groups together all at the same time. And so that transitions us into bivariate analysis, where you're talking about comparing two different variables. And then finally, introduction to multivariate analysis. And that goes hand in hand with the chapter on regression in your other textbook in the, I can't remember the name of the other textbook. The other textbook. Let me just look it up. Sorry about that. Statistics in Plain English. Goes along with chapter 13 of Statistics in Plain English, where you talk about multiple linear regression. And then again, that feeds into the classwork and the lab and the SPSS assignment for this week, as well as what you will ultimately do in your final project. So make sure that you have a pretty good understanding of that. And then lastly, again, ethics and quantitative data analysis. Basically, people often say you can find a study to defend any opinion you want. And in some ways, I can't necessarily disagree with that, in that sometimes there's ethics involved and sometimes data is just confusing. The social world is not a consistent place. And so we're working in soft sciences. It's hard to know for sure about things, but we definitely want to be ethical and above board in the work that we do. So there's just some discussion there about the ways that it might be tempting to be unethical in quantitative data analysis and why it's important to avoid those things at the end of that chapter. All right, so that's chapters 12 and 14 in the basics of social research. If you have any questions, do let me know.